Hi, it's Gary Ford from Tiger Hobbies Limited. This video marks the 90th anniversary of what is possibly the most iconic aircraft in aviation history, certainly the top few, the Supermarine Spitfire, later known as the Vickers Supermarine Spitfire. What I'll be doing is a series of 3 videos. The first is going to give you some very basic information on the Spitfire, such as marks, such as armament, and a few of the anomalies of the actual Spitfire during its development. The second video will cover the Spitfire Mark V, possibly the most misunderstood of all the marks of Spitfire, especially the ones who were slightly Luftwaffe wearable types, and some of the reasons why it failed a little bit against the Focke-Wulf 190. A lot of this wasn't down to the Spitfire, it was down to Royal Air Force tactics and lack of briefing of their pilots. And the third video, the shorter video, will be looking in detail at some of the models, fantastic Spitfire models you can buy from Tiger Hobbies Limited at www.tigerhobbies.co.uk and look for Spitfire at 90. So the first video is going to be looking at some of the basic information that if you're interested in Spitfires or you don't really know a great deal about Spitfires, I'll give you some of the very basic information about the Supermarine Spitfire. So, the story starts in March 1936 at Eastleigh Airport, now Southampton Airport, where Captain Joseph Mutt Summers, test pilot for Supermarine, took off in K5054, the prototype Spitfire, painted in a light blue finish. After about 10 minutes in the air, he landed and reportedly told its chief designer, R.J. Mitchell, "Don't change a thing." Mitchell, though, was not a well man, and sadly Mitchell would not live to see the aircraft enter full service with the Royal Air Force, passing away in 1937. However, he did see accepted as a new fighter. Following his death, Joseph Smith eventually would take over the leadership of the design team and would go on to develop the Spitfire from the Mark II through to the Mark 24 in just over 5 years. Performance increased dramatically from around about 350 miles an hour to almost 500 in level flight on some of the later marks. No doubt there'll be plenty of videos released for this important anniversary, so I'll try to cover, as I mentioned earlier, a few areas that might not be discussed elsewhere. And of course, we shall look at our fantastic range of Spitfire models, both plastic kit and die-cast. I'll be covering several Spitfire marks and why they came about, along with wing armament and lesser known subjects about things like engine revolution and boost limitations. These were not fully understood or properly implemented by the Royal Air Force until well into 1941, which unfortunately cost the lives of many pilots in those disastrous fighter sweep raids of 41 and 42, flying the misunderstood Mark V, and this will come in the second episode. So let's start with the basic Spitfire marks. If there's one thing you could learn about the Spitfire, if you know nothing else about Spitfires, learn this one thing. There's only actual 3 marks of Spitfire. Yes, I know there's 24 marks, but most of the marks are developments of 3 core marks. And these marks are the Mark 1/2, R.J. Mitchell's original design, the Mark 8 and 20 series, obviously designed by Joseph Smith and his team. And as stated, all the Spitfires and Seafire variants were development of these core designs. It's also worth noting that Spitfires up to PR19 were known as Roman Spitfires, used the Roman numeral system. So the PR19 can be referred to as the PR19, but when you write it down, it should always be the PRX1X. From the 20 series onwards, known as Arabic numeral Spitfires. So both written and referred 20 rather than XX. So now let's briefly look at the wing types and armament. This is the next bit you really need, which is important, because you often see Spitfires Bs and Cs and Ds and Es. This is referring to the armament or wings, and there are 5 basic wings: the A wing, the B wing, the C wing, the D wing, and of course the E wing. So early Mark Spitfire Mark 1s featured a wing armed with 8.303 machine guns. When we talk about the wing, we talk about the all main plane, not the port wing or starboard wing. So the wing is the all main plane armed with 8.303 machine guns. The reason they come up with 8 are down to a young girl, a schoolgirl in fact, working with her father, a designer, stated that the Browning machine gun gave a cyclic rate, that's the amount of rounds it could push through in a minute, of 1,200 rounds. So by having 8, that would give 9,600 rounds cyclic, enough firepower to bring down the German bombers. Again, very misunderstood about the Spitfire's armament, saying that the .303 was a pea shooter. No, it was not a pea shooter. Especially if you're pumping out that amount of lead, you're going to do some damage. Remember, with the Royal Air Force, didn't need to shoot down these German aircraft. All they need to do was damage them, because they weren't coming back, because the Luftwaffe did not have the an organisation called, like what we got in the UK, called the CRO, the Civilian Repair Organisation, that literally took battered Spitfires and Hurricanes, even crashed aircraft, recovered spares what they could get off those aircraft, and got as many aircraft back into service as possible. The problem with the Germans, they built all these aircraft, but they didn't think about repairing really, or the logistics behind their fighting a war. So in June 1940, experiments introduced 2 20mm cannons, the spinal cannons, along with a reduced complement of 4 .303 machine guns, and this led to the designation of a B wing, while the original machine gun version will be retro designed as the Mark 1A, or the A wing. By the time of the Battle of Britain, these A and B distinctions were in common use, certainly at the height of the Battle of Britain. The early cannon installations, though, suffered from jamming issues, so relatively few Mark 1Bs were built. And in fact, 19 Squadron, one of the first to get, in fact the first squadron to get the Spitfire, was so disappointed with these jamming cannons, they demanded their Mark 1As back, and these Mark 1B aircraft was shifted off somewhere else. This really wasn't sorted out until improvements led to a more reliable B-wing that came into the Mark 2B. But again, they weren't built in huge numbers, and it would be the Mark 5 Spitfire that really saw the maturity of the cannon-armed Spitfire. The C-wing. The C-wing was introduced in 1941, known as the Universal Wing. It featured improved cannon cooling, belt-fed ammunition instead of drum feeding, so it fed better. It also allowed different armament configurations that could be done at squadron level, including up to 4 20mm cannons, or 2 20mm cannons and the 4 machine guns, or you could even strip it back to an A-wing configuration. So these C-wings were used on things like the Mark 5, the Mark 8s, the Mark 9s, Mark 14s, and the later Packard Merlin 16s. The D-wing was designed purely for photographic reconnaissance. No armament, just extra fuel tanks to get the Spitfires over to Berlin and deep into Germany to take photograph reconnaissance pictures. It was an improvement on the earlier photographic reconnaissance wing and really equipped aircraft such as the PR-10, PR-11, PR-13, and later obviously the PR-90. The E-wing, known as the Late Universal Wing, was introduced in 1944, mid-1944. Typically carried 2 20mm cannons, and on the inboard, 2 .50 caliber machine guns. It had better ammunition feed system and allowed for bomb carrying capabilities. If you ever go to RAF Wittering, and I was stationed at Cottesmore just up the road, so I used to visit RAF Wittering on a regular basis, in one of the hangar doors there was some damage caused by bullets, and these bullets were .5, and people said, well, they can't understand, it can't be the RAF because Spitfires never filled with .5 caliber machine guns, or .50s. Well, we know in the E-wing it certainly did. But there was a problem with the E-wing. The earlier wings, as the wheels came down, just in case the pilot in his, his pressure of coming to a combat mission, as the wheels came down, it automatically put on the armament safety switches. But in the E-wing, it didn't. And the pilot had to make sure that the guns were at safe. This particular pilot taxied his late Mark Spitfire up to the hangar at RAF Wittering, didn't put his guns on safe, got out the aircraft, his knee hit the firing button, and a burst of .50 went into the hangar doors, hence the damage to the hangar with .50 machine guns. So that's the wing armament. Again, it's important to know this as well as the 3 basic marks of Spitfire. So let's look at the individual marks now. Of course, the Mark 1. So the Mark 1 entered service, R.J. Mitchell's design, and with not a huge amount of improvement, in 1938 with number 19 Squadron at Duxford. Early versions had flat canopies, two-bladed fixed pitch propellers. Compared to the Hurricane, the Spitfire was more complex to produce, so numbers built up more slowly. So by the time the war started, there was at least 3 times as many of the more easily to build Hawker Hurricane. But the problem with the early Spitfires, like a lot of machinery designed and built just before the war, it was literally pushed into service. Wartime expediency building up to war. As a result, the early Spitfires, apart from its obvious short range, its engines weren't that good. The early Merlins were overheating and somewhat unreliable. This was sorted in the Mark II Spitfire that was introduced in 1940. This featured a more powerful Merlin 12 engine, improved cooling, and a Kaufman starter system. Next ones we'll look at is Mark III and Mark IV. The Mark III, purely experimental, and it would pave the way for the later Merlin-powered Spitfires, such as the Mark Vs, Mark IXs, perhaps Mark XVs. The Mark IV was again an experimental aircraft initially that would pave the way for Griffon engines. The Griffon engine, the powerful Griffon engine, started developing before the war and was on the Mark IV early in the war. And again, it would pave the way for the later Griffon engine Spitfires, or certainly the early Griffon engine Spitfires. Now, there's a point to note, the Mark IV would be redesignated Mark XII, and the Mark IV numeral would be given over to the early PR Spitfire, the PR Mark IV. So the next Spitfire we shall look at is the Mark V, which you see a number of Mark Vs down there, just down on the right. One of our die-cast Hobby Master, one of our best-selling ones, unfortunately sold out now. It's the Spitfire Mark V RFD Donald Duck, formed by Jan Zumbalk, the top-scoring Polish ace attached to the Royal Air Force. Misunderstood aircraft, and I shall go into more detail in episode 2 on the Mark V. Again, it was the standard Royal Air Force day fight from 1941 to about late 42, although it remained in service right through to the war. The Spitfire Mark Vs were in action over D-Day and later on. The next 2 variants we shall look at is the Mark VI and Mark VII. These are high-altitude aircraft. Now, what happened early on in the war, the Germans, with an aircraft called the Ju-186, a development of the Ju-88, flying with, I think they even had diesel engines, flying at horrendous heights, 40-odd thousand feet, above Britain, invulnerable to anything, taking pictures. So what we needed to do was to come up with a system to get them. We tried going up there with Mark Vs and things like that, we just couldn't catch them. So the Mark VI was developed. Now, this was pressurised, but the pilot had to be literally sealed in the cockpit and given a big Weber pistol to shoot himself out. This was improved with the Mark VII, so this had a fully sliding pressurised cockpit, and of course they had extended wingtips and a Merlin 61 engine. And in fact, it was a Mark VII that damaged the Ju-186, and I do believe at 46,000 feet, being the highest combat recorded in World War II. The next Mark we shall look at is the Mark VIII. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, the Mark V had a bit of a rough time over France in the fighter suites. When it came across in 1941, the reports of a radial engine German aircraft. The Mark V was holding its own against the the BF-109Es and BF-109Fs. But when this thing came about, the FW-190, Focke-Wulf 190, it came as a bit of a shock. Yes, it had a great roll rate and higher in the climb. And the poor old Mark V had a bit of an hard time. Now, in, I think, 41, one landed at, I think, Pembrey in Wales. We took it, this Focke-Wulf, it landed by mistake. We took it to the Aircraft and Armaments establishment and sussed out its strengths and weaknesses. And we started developing a brand new Spitfire. A brand new airframe. Yes, it looked very similar to the early Spitfires, but internally it was slightly different and made ease of production so they could build them a lot quicker. And this will be the Mark VIII. It had a retractable tail wheel, so to give an extra 15 mile an hour top end. It had a powerful version of the Merlin engine, but it took a long time to get into service. So much so that when it did get it into service, the RAF were not interested. Because between the Mark VIII being developed and the desperation for a Spitfire to take on the FW-190 on a more equal terms, they took a Mark V airframe and took the Merlin 61 from the Mark 7, strapped it onto the Mark V, and it became a stopgap fighter called the Mark 9. Probably the most famous Spitfire Mark of them all, known as the Mercurial Mark 9, and would be the prime Royal Air Force day fighter in numbers in Northwest Europe to the very, very end of the war. And they were not interested in the Mark 8. So the Mark 8 was given to the Royal Canadian Air Force, it was given to the United States Army Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, and eventually given to the Royal Air Force in the Far East from March of 1944. And in the later episode, when I talk about the Mark 9, I'll cover a little about the Hurricane being the prime day fighter in the Far East until March of 1944, till the first Mark 8s got there. So after the Mark 9, we'll cover 3 aircraft, which I mentioned briefly, the Mark 10, the Mark 11, and the Mark 13. These are all photographic reconnaissance Spitfires. Cover the Mark 11 first, which is basically the photographic reconnaissance version of the Mark 9. Good aircraft, really was the prime photographic reconnaissance aircraft for the Royal Air Force and built in the largest numbers during the war. But for some reason wasn't pressurised. So the pilots could go to high altitude, long range, but had to be on oxygen all the time, dressed in the warmest of clothing. The Mark 10, that was really for high altitude, but they didn't make many. And the Mark 13 was optimised for low altitude. I might have got that the wrong way. It could have been the Mark 10, 13 the other way around. If you know that, please let me know. But basically, they had aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft for high altitude and low altitude. But it really wasn't sorted out until the later Mark 19 came along. So the next aircraft we shall look at is the Mark 14. Now, the Mark 14 was introduced in 1944 after they got rid of the very few squadrons that used the Mark 12, which was the first Griffon engine Spitfire to be built and put into operation, but wasn't really particularly successful, but was the basis of the later Seafires, which I'll mention later on. So what they took was basically a Mark 8 airframe, as you can see the Mark 8 airframe in diecast just down on the left, a Royal Australian Air Force Mark 8, Grey Nurse, V round large E. Took the Mark 8 airframe and stuck on it a more refined version of the Griffon with a much larger 5-bladed propeller. And again, down on the front with the diecast aircraft, you'll see a Mark 14 lower back flown by Johnny Johnson with this massive propeller. Huge, great propeller, massive amounts of power in both low back and high back configuration. Some say the very best point defence fighter interceptor of the war was the Mark 14. If you had a piece of sky, 2 aircraft in that piece of sky, it would be the Mark 14 that will come out on top. But like all Spitfires, it was affected by its range. But as a pure interceptor and point defence aircraft, it was probably the best of its fighter type during the war. So after the Mark 14, there are 2 more aircraft, which is the Mark 15 and Mark 17. I'm going to drop those out because they are Seafires, but I'm going to explain that a little later. So the next one we shall look at will be the Mark 16. Now, if you look at the back on the display up on your left, you'll see an Airfix FR Mike 18. Again, I'll come on to a little later. And just above that is a little yellow box, which is an Ella 1/72nd scale Mark 16. And behind there's a big Tamiya Mark 16 as well. Now, the 16 was basically a Mark 9 fitted with the US Packard-built Merlin. So it's basically a Mark 9, but with the Packard-built Merlin. Now, one of the most famous pilots of this aircraft, if fans of the old Top Gear, remember a presenter who used to also do Tomorrow's World, Raymond Baxter. Now, Raymond Baxter always used to do aviation programmes for the BBC. He joined the Royal Air Force quite late, but qualifying as a fighter pilot at the back end of the war, flew his missions on the Mark 16 in the ground attack role. As I mentioned earlier on, the Airfix one's a Mark 18, known as the FR-18, the development of the Mark 14, with, as you can see, a much bigger tail, generally in the low back configuration. Again, didn't see war service, but was the last Royal Air Force aircraft in combat in 1951 over Malaya in the Malaya emergency. So, the last of the Roman numeral Spitfires we'll talk about is the PR-19, as I mentioned before. Always said as PR-19, but wrote down as X1X. Now, the PR-19 entered service in 1944 and literally was probably the most effective photographic reconnaissance aircraft there ever was. It probably could use it today. This thing could fly at 50,000 feet, 400 odd miles an hour. You could hardly see this tiny aircraft and take amazing pictures. It actually remained in Royal Air Force service until 1957, when the very last Royal Air Force Spitfires retired at RAF Woodvale in Lancashire. At Thump Flight, the weather flight. These aircraft, after retiring, will be handed over, or some of these aircraft, PR-19s, were handed over to the Royal Air Force Historic Flight, I think went to Coltishall, that much later, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, would be renamed the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. So, I'm going to cover the 20 series briefly. The 20 series, known as Arabic Spitfires, so they're wrote and referred to by the number 20, not XX or XX11 or something like that. So it's pure 20, and these were Marks 20 experimental, the Mark 21 that did see wartime service, the Mark 22, the Mark 23 experimental, and the very last Spitfire was the Mark 24. These are major structural redesigns, massive performance, but producing so little numbers, with only, I think, the Mark 21 actually seeing wartime service. The rest of them served into the 50s with the Royal Auxiliary Air Force squadrons and Far East squadrons, places like Hong Kong. But actually, the last Spitfires in service were not these. The things like the 18s and the PR-19s outlived them in service. Now, the last thing we should look at with Spitfires is actually sister, the Seafire. Now, the Seafire were given its own designation, Seafires 1, 2, and 3, as Roman numerals. Now, they're all based on the Mark V airframe. The first one, Seafire 1, was basically a converted Mark V airframe. Seafire 2 was another Mark V airframe, but built in the factory as a naval aircraft from the get-go. It wasn't a conversion. And the most numerous of the Seafires during the war, certainly the back end of the war in the British Pacific Fleet, was the Seafire F Mark III. This was based on the late Spitfire VC airframe, I do believe, with a four-bladed propeller. So it looks a bit like a Mark 9, but it's actually based on the VC. But again, a naval aircraft from the get-go with folding wings and a slightly improved undercarriage, as the earlier Seafires is literally just a break up on landing. With the Mark 15, they decided to drop the individual Seafire designation and bring it into the Supermarines Spitfire numeral system. But it retained, obviously, Seafire. And this was the Seafire Mark 15, which used the shorter Griffon engine with four-bladed propeller, used in high-back configuration, were tested during the war, entered actual service during the war, but saw no operational service. Right at the end of the war, the Seafires and the carriers were the Seafire 3s. And then the Seafire 17, very similar to the 15, but in the low back configuration, and that basically saw wartime service and may have even served in Korea, I do believe. And then later on, the very, very last of this line of aircraft would be Seafires, and that would be the FR-46 and FR-47, which Airfix do a really nice 48 scale kit of that aircraft. They occasionally do releasing, it's well worth picking up. So that's the first episode covering the very basic marks of Spitfire. Again, all the kits you see in front, the plastic kits are all in stock. The die-cast, only two of the die-casts are actually in stock. The rest are from our archive just for demonstration purposes, and I'll go into that on the third episode when I look at the kits in detail. But the next episode will be about the Spitfire Mark V in combat over the Northwest Europe during the fighter sweeps. So once again, thank you very much for listening to this talk about the 90th anniversary of the Spitfire, episode 1.